Good evening, everyone. Before we begin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. Every comment helps these disturbing stories find their way back to you. Now, let's step into the darkness. The first time I realized something was wrong in the town of Bristow Creek, Washington, was the night my neighbor's porch light stayed on for 3 days straight. I had just moved there at 29 after taking a job with a logistics company based out of Tacoma. Bristow Creek wasn't even on most maps. It was one of those in-between towns tucked into a pocket of forest and farmland, the kind of place people passed on the highway without ever stopping unless their car broke down. I liked that about it. I was coming off a messy divorce, a string of bad apartments, and years of city noise that never seemed to shut off. Bristow Creek was quiet, almost aggressively quiet. One main road, a single gas station, a grocery store with one broken sliding door that never closed all the way, and a neighborhood of identical single-story houses built in the 80s when someone still thought this place might grow. My house sat at the very end of Juniper Lane, a pale blue box with white trim and a sagging mailbox that leaned slightly toward the road like it was tired of standing. The house beside mine was owned by a man named Harold Lunt, mid-60s, retired logger, quiet, lived alone. The realtor described him as reclusive but harmless, said he mostly kept to himself and grew tomatoes the size of softballs in the summer. The first 3 weeks I lived there, I saw him exactly twice. Once when he waved at me while watering his lawn at 6 in the morning. The second time when he took his trash out at midnight and barely reacted when I startled him by pulling into my driveway. That night is when his porch light first stayed on. At first I assumed he'd just forgotten to turn it off. Old people do that. I've heard worse excuses for less strange behavior. But after the second night, it started to feel odd. The light was bright, too bright for a porch bulb. It threw a wide yellow cone across his empty driveway and illuminated his front windows enough for me to see the glare reflected on his curtains. And yet, I never saw movement inside. No silhouettes, no flickers of TV light, nothing. On the third night, I finally mentioned it to someone, a woman named Renee who worked at the gas station 2 blocks away. She was in her early 40s, tired eyes, quick tongue. When I mentioned Harold's porch light, her expression changed in a way that made my stomach tighten. Not alarmed, not surprised, more like she'd been waiting for someone else to notice. She told me Harold usually turned his lights off by 9. Power bills were money, she said, and Harold was careful with money. Then she asked me a strange question, if I'd seen him outside recently. I told her no, not in almost a month now. Renee went quiet for a moment, then shrugged, and said maybe he'd gone to stay with family. I remember thinking she didn't sound like she believed it. 2 days later, the light was still on. That's when the smell started. It hit me when I stepped out of my front, Dr. Early one morning still half asleep and holding a travel mug of coffee. The air had that wet, evergreen scent Washington is famous for, but under that was something thick and sweet and rotten. The kind of smell that makes your throat tighten before your brain catches up. I followed it without realizing I was doing it. Just a few steps into my yard, then another toward the edge of his fence. The wind shifted slightly, and the smell became undeniable. Decay. Something dead. Something that had been sitting. I called the non-emergency police line before I even finished my coffee. I told them my neighbor might be hurt or worse. The woman on the other end sounded bored, in the way only a small-town dispatcher can. She said they'd send someone to check on him when a unit was available. It wasn't until 5 hours later that a cruiser finally rolled down Juniper Lane. By that time, the smell had grown stronger. I stood on my porch pretending to check my phone while the officer knocked on Harold's door. He knocked twice, then again, harder. No answer. He walked around the side of the house but came back quickly, covering his nose with his sleeve. He called for backup. An ambulance arrived first, then another cruiser. then someone from the county sheriff's office. They broke the front door just after noon. I wasn't allowed inside, but the smell that rolled out was enough to tell me everything I needed to know. Harold had been dead for at least a week. They said heart attack. That was the official word that made it into the short newspaper article 2 days later. A quiet death in his living room. No signs of forced entry, no foul play. The porch light, they said, must have been left on accidentally. The smell was only noticed recently because the weather had shifted warmer. That should have been the end of it. But the night after his body was removed, the porch light turned back on. I know this because I was awake when it happened. It was just after 1 a.m. I couldn't sleep. That hollow post-divorce insomnia that leaves your body exhausted, but your mind buzzing. My living room faced directly toward Harold's place. I had the curtains open because I liked watching the trees move in the wind. That light had been off since the coroner van took him away. The house had been dark for hours. Then, without warning, that same yellow glare snapped back on. Bright, sudden, like someone had flipped the switch with intent. I sat up slowly on my couch. Every rational thought in my head tried to explain it. Power surge, faulty wiring, automatic timer I didn't know about. But none of those explained why the light had been off all evening. The next morning, I called the utility company. They said the meter to Harold's house had been locked out. No active power should have been running. When I told them the porch light was clearly on, the woman on the line paused and asked if I was sure I wasn't mistaken. I told her no, I could see it from my window every night. She promised to send a tech. They never showed up. What did show up 2 days later was a moving truck. A gray rental truck pulled up in front of Harold's house just as the sun was starting to set. No for sale sign, no paperwork posted in the window, no warning. A man in his late 30s got out of the cab first. Tall, broad shoulders, clean cut in a way that felt intentional, like he cared very deeply about appearing normal. A woman followed behind him, shorter, blonde ponytail. She scanned the neighborhood like someone checking for witnesses before committing a crime. They didn't look at me directly, but I knew they saw me standing on my porch. They moved in fast. No inspectors, no locksmiths, no trash crews, just furniture, boxes, and a single large plastic-wrapped object that took 4 men to carry inside. It was shaped too evenly to be furniture. Long, heavy, covered completely in thick black plastic. They maneuvered it carefully through Harold's front door, like they were afraid of damaging it more than the house. The porch light stayed on the entire time. That night, the smell returned. Only this time, it wasn't rotting. It was chemical, sharp, like cleaning solution mixed with something sour underneath. Strong enough that I closed my windows and still smelled it through the cracks. I lay awake listening to sounds drift through the thin walls of our houses. The low hum of machinery, the metallic clank of something being dragged, the thud of weight hitting the floor again and again. No voices, no arguments, just work. When I woke up the next morning, the moving truck was gone. The porch light was still on. I finally met the man who moved into Harold's house 3 days later. His name was Evan Mercer. That's what he told me, at least. He approached me while I was collecting my mail. Perfect timing. Perfect posture. He smiled with his mouth, but not his eyes. He said he worked in property renovation, bought foreclosures, flipped them, asked how long I'd been living next door. I told him only a month. His smile tightened slightly at that. Then he said something that made the back of my neck prickle. He said he hoped the smell from the old owner hadn't lingered too badly. I hadn't mentioned the smell. I asked if he planned on replacing the porch bulb. He laughed once. A short sound like he hadn't expected the question. Then he said he preferred to leave the light on, for security. The first night I truly understood something was wrong came a week later. It was raining, a slow, soaking kind of rain that turns dirt to soup and makes the trees whisper against each other. I came home late from work. As I pulled into my driveway, my headlights swept across Evan's porch. And for the first time since Harold died, I saw someone standing in that yellow light. It wasn't Evan. The figure was thin, younger, barefoot. He stood facing the door, not the street. His posture was rigid, arms hanging loosely at his sides, skin pale in the glare of the bulb. I couldn't see his face because his head was tilted slightly downward, chin tucked in too tight. He didn't move, not even when my car engine cut off and the headlights faded. I sat frozen behind my steering wheel for a full minute before I forced myself to step out of the car. The rain soaked my jacket instantly. The figure was still there, still facing the door, still unmoving. I called out to him. My voice came out weak. He didn't respond. Then the porch light shut off. Darkness swallowed him completely. No footsteps, no retreat, just instant absence. The next morning, there were wet footprints leading from Evan's front door straight into the trees behind his house. They were barefoot, and they were fresh. I didn't sleep that night after seeing the barefoot figure on Evan Mercer's porch. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the outline of that pale body in the yellow light. The way it vanished the exact second the bulb went dark. I told myself there had to be a rational explanation. A guest, a lost kid, someone high or confused, who wandered onto the wrong porch and bolted when the light went out. Every explanation I came up with sounded weak the moment I said it out loud in my empty living room. The footprints were gone by morning. Rain had washed them away sometime before sunrise. Evan's porch light was back on like nothing had happened. I went to work on autopilot, moved boxes, checked shipping sheets. Ever-present warehouse noise filled my head enough to keep my thoughts from spiraling. But by the time I drove back down Juniper Lane that evening, the dread came rushing back. His house looked the same, curtain drawn, light on, no visible movement, just that steady, unblinking glow. I decided to do something I should have done earlier. I went to the town records office. Bristow Creek's municipal building was small enough that one woman handled all public records. Her name was Linda. Late 50s, smelled faintly of cigarettes and copier toner. I asked about Harold Lunt's property. She pulled the file without hesitation. That hesitance finally showed when I asked who sold it to Evan Mercer. She flipped through the paperwork slowly, then stopped. There was no Evan Mercer listed as the buyer. The house had been sold through a shell LLC registered out of Spokane. Cash purchase, no financing, no inspection contingencies. Closed in under 48 hours. I asked if that was normal. Linda gave me a look that told me everything without saying it outright. It was not. Something else caught my eye. A note in the file from the county medical examiner. Not public record. Accidentally left clipped to the folder. I shouldn't have read it. I did anyway. Cause of death officially listed as heart failure. But the addendum noted severe blunt trauma along the rib cage and upper spine. Injuries inconsistent with a natural fall. The note said further, investigation was recommended. The investigation never happened. I left the building with my chest tight and my hands shaking. That night, I heard footsteps in my backyard. Slow, heavy, deliberate, not wandering, not pacing. Just one steady circuit along the fence line. I turned off every light in my house and watched from behind the edge of my kitchen curtain. The porch light next door stayed on. No shadow crossed it. Whoever was out there stayed just far enough into the line of trees that I couldn't see them. The footsteps stopped at my bedroom window. There was no tapping this time. No sound at all. Just the sense of presence so strong it felt like electrical pressure in my skull. I didn't breathe. I didn't blink. I stayed exactly where I was for what felt like an hour. Eventually, the pressure lifted. The footsteps returned to the tree line and faded into the rain. The next morning, I found something pressed into the mud beneath my window. A handprint. Small, narrow, like it belonged to someone young. It was deep, as if whoever left it had leaned all their weight against the glass. That was the moment I stopped telling myself this was coincidence. I began watching Evan's house closely after that. Not obviously. I didn't sit in my window like a paranoid shut-in. I just paid attention. Delivery schedules, trash nights. The hours his lights went on and off. He never put a TV in his living room. Never opened the front windows. Every night, precisely at 8:47 p.m., the porch light flicked on. Every night, precisely at 4:12 a.m., it turned off. Not a minute early, not a minute late. I also noticed that sometimes the smell returned. It drifted through the neighborhood in waves, sharp disinfectant layered over something faintly organic, like rot buried under bleach. When that smell appeared, the porch light stayed on all day, as well as all night. Renee at the gas station stopped smiling at me after I asked her about Evan. She told me no one in town went near that house anymore. She said people heard things. She said 2 kids had dared each other to knock on the door a month earlier and run. One of them came back screaming. The other one never spoke about what he saw. He just refused to walk down Juniper Lane ever again. 3 weeks later, I found an envelope taped to my front door. No name. No return address. Inside was a single printed photograph. It was my bedroom window, taken from inside Evan's house. I recognized the angle immediately. The photo had been shot through his front window, across the street, straight into my room. The printout was grainy, but clear enough to make out the outline of my bed. Clear enough to make out the fact that I had been sleeping when it was taken. On the back, in clean black ink, were 3 words. Lights keep you safe. I called the sheriff's office. Not the non-emergency line, the real one. 2 deputies arrived an hour later. They went next door, knocked, rang the bell. No answer. They circled the property. One of them radioed for a warrant. The other stayed with me on my porch while we waited. Neither of them joked. Neither of them tried to downplay what I'd shown them. When they finally forced Evan's door open, the smell hit like a wall. I watched them enter, watched their shoulders stiffen, heard one of them gag. Minutes passed. More deputies arrived, then an unmarked county vehicle, then someone from the state. I wasn't allowed inside, but I didn't need to be. Later that night, a deputy told me what they found. Harold Lunt had not died of a heart attack. He had been beaten. His body had been kept cold. Evan Mercer wasn't a flipper. He wasn't a contractor. He wasn't even the man's real name. He was part of a 2-person operation connected to multiple missing persons cases across eastern Washington and northern Oregon. They targeted elderly homeowners living alone, forced them to sign over property, kept them sedated in makeshift rooms built into basements and crawl spaces, used the houses as temporary holding sites while they cleaned money through shell companies. Some victims were moved. Some of them didn't leave alive. The plastic-wrapped object I'd seen being carried inside that night was a refrigeration unit. The barefoot footprints belonged to a boy who had gone missing from Spokane 3 months earlier. They found his fingerprints on my window. Evan was gone when the deputies entered the house, but the basement wasn't empty. They found 3 restrained individuals still alive beneath Harold's living room floor, weak, dehydrated, drugged into compliance. One of them was a woman in her 70s who owned property in Oregon. She had been missing for almost 2 months. The boy from Spokane was not among them. The state tore the house apart over the following weeks. Soil testing, forensics, dog units. The trees behind both our homes were dug up. What they found out there was not publicized. The sheriff told me only that some of the victims hadn't survived long enough to be moved. Evan Mercer was never caught. The porch light finally went out for good when the power company disconnected the line. I moved out of Bristow Creek 15 days later. Sometimes, in my new apartment, I still wake up at exactly 4:12 a.m. with no idea why. And sometimes, for just a second, I swear I can smell bleach in the air. The girl vanished from the ferry without a single eyewitness. That's what the news said the next morning. No struggle. No surveillance footage of her leaving the deck. No one heard a scream. One moment she was standing at the railing on the upper level of the Tacoma-Vashon ferry, and the next moment she was gone. The official explanation was that she must have jumped. That's what they always say when they don't have answers. But I was there that night, and she did not jump. Her name was Alana Ricks, 22, graphic design student at a community college in Olympia. She was standing 3 feet from me, laughing into her phone, when she disappeared. It was late October, cold enough that the wind off Commencement Bay cut through jackets. The ferry ride was mostly empty at that hour. A few commuters heading home, a couple of trucks, a handful of foot passengers scattered across the upper deck. I had boarded after a double shift at the port warehouse, and all I wanted was to stand outside, breathe salt air, and numb my brain before I went home to my empty apartment in Gig Harbor. Alana was already at the railing when I stepped onto the deck. She was facing the water, phone held up like she was on FaceTime. I remember noticing her because she was smiling so wide it looked forced, like she was trying to convince whoever was on the other end that she was having more fun than she really was. I took my place a few feet away, leaned on the metal rail, and stared out at the lights reflecting across the black water. I heard her say, "I'll text you when I get off, okay?" Then she laughed and added, "Relax, it's just a ferry." That was the last normal thing she ever said. The wind gusted hard enough to make the deck vibrate. The ferry horn sounded low and distant as we cleared the dock. I shifted my weight to brace myself against the cold. When I looked back toward where Alana had been standing, there was no one there. At first I thought she'd gone inside. Then I noticed her phone. It was still lying on the railing where her hand had been resting. Screen lit, video call still connected. For several seconds, I just stared at it, trying to process what I was seeing. The phone buzzed on the metal surface as the person on the other end spoke. I couldn't hear the words over the wind, but I could see a man's face moving on the bright screen. He looked confused, then concerned, then alarmed. I picked the phone up without thinking. There was no one on the water below. No ripples, no splash, no sound of anyone falling. The ferry was moving too fast for someone to disappear silently. I told the man on the screen that the girl had vanished. I remember how wrong the word vanished felt coming out of my mouth. He kept asking where she went. I kept saying I didn't know. Within minutes, crew members were on the deck, radios crackling, voices sharp with urgency. The ferry slowed. Spotlights cut across the dark water. Passengers were told to remain where they were. They never found her. Not a shoe, not a jacket, not a drop of blood. The Coast Guard searched until sunrise. The tide was wrong for a clean disappearance, they said. The currents should have pushed something back toward the surface, but the water stayed empty. Alana Ricks was declared missing, then presumed dead. I gave my statement twice. Once to ferry security, once to a state trooper. I told them about the phone, about the man on the screen, about the fact that she vanished without a sound. They nodded. They wrote. They thanked me. Then they moved on. I tried to move on too. I couldn't, because 3 days after she disappeared, someone knocked on my apartment door at 2 a.m. It was Alana's mother. She had puffy eyes and shaking hands, and a folded photo clutched to her chest, like it was the only thing keeping her upright. She said the ferry company had given her my name as the last person who had physically been near her daughter. She asked if she could come in. I let her. We sat at my tiny kitchen table under harsh ceiling light. She showed me the photo. Alana at 16, prom dress, nervous smile. Her mother asked me to tell her exactly what happened. So I did. Every detail. The railing, the phone, the silence. When I told her there was no splash, no cry, no sign of falling, her face changed in a way I can't explain without feeling sick. She whispered, "Then he took her." I asked who he was. Her hands tightened around the edge of the table. She told me Alana had been receiving messages for weeks before she disappeared, from a man she met online. He called himself Mason. No last name. No social media profiles. Just a private messaging account with no photos. He told Alana he worked on the water, that he traveled between ports, that he saw her once on a ferry months earlier and couldn't forget her. He knew the days she rode, the times, the routes. Her mother thought it was just a creepy guy sending messages. She never told the police. 2 days after Alana vanished, her mother received a package in the mail. Inside was Alana's phone case, the same one I had seen on the ferry railing. The tracking label showed it had been shipped from a post office less than 10 miles from the Tacoma dock. The police told her it was probably a sick prank from someone who found the phone after it fell into the water. But the phone hadn't fallen into the water. It had been taken, and someone wanted her mother to know it. After that visit, everything in my life changed. I started seeing men who weren't really there. Or maybe they were. On my walk to work, I'd catch the reflection of someone in store windows walking just a few paces behind me. When I turned, the sidewalk would be empty. On the ferry, I noticed the same man on different crossings. Different clothes, same height, same posture, always standing near the rail, always looking at the water, always looking in my direction. Then my phone rang one night with a blocked number. When I answered, there was only the sound of waves. After several seconds, a man spoke. He said my name, and he said it exactly the way Alana had said it on the ferry. The man on the phone said my name, using Alana's voice, and then the line went dead. I stood in my kitchen staring at my reflection in the dark microwave door, my heart slamming so violently I thought I might pass out. I tried to call the number back. Blocked. No trace. No voicemail. Just that voice burned into my head like a recording that wouldn't stop looping. I didn't tell the police. That is the part I regret the most. Over the next week, the calls continued. Always at night. Always from a blocked number. Sometimes it was only waves and distant engine noise. Sometimes breathing. Sometimes silence so thick it felt intentional. Twice he used Alana's voice again. Short phrases. Ordinary things she could have said on that ferry. It's cold out here. The lights are pretty tonight. I stopped answering after that. The calls didn't stop. Then the messages started. Photos. The first one showed dark water under a floodlight. The reflection of a ferry hull trembling across the surface. No people, no context, just enough to make me recognize the location. Commencement Bay. The second photo was worse. A small room, metal walls, condensation streaking down from the ceiling. A narrow mattress bolted to the floor, a hand resting on the edge of the frame, pale, female, a familiar chipped nail on the thumb. It was Alana's hand. I took the images to the sheriff's office that morning. They traced the IP to a series of proxy servers and dead digital routes that collapsed into nothing. Professional-grade soft masking, the kind used by organized networks, not random predators. They reopened Alana's case, task force, state involvement, Port Authority cooperation, patrol boats. Ferry manifests reviewed for months back. Every male who matched my description was questioned. Too late. 3 days after the investigation reopened, Alana's body surfaced. Fishermen found her tangled in debris near an industrial spillway south of Tacoma. The water had preserved her longer than it should have. The medical examiner said she'd been alive for several days after the ferry incident. Drugged, restrained, moved by boat, then killed. Her lungs contained almost no water. She hadn't drowned. She had been murdered before being placed in the bay. The case went quiet after that. Publicly, it was listed as a homicide with unknown suspects. Internally, it was something else. I found this out later through a detective who drank too much and finally told me the truth after I quit asking. They believed Alana had been taken by someone with direct port access, someone who could move cargo without inspection, someone who knew blind zones between surveillance points, someone who worked on the water. The calls stopped after her body was found. The photos stopped too. For a month, nothing happened. Then I started seeing him again. Always at ferry crossings I didn't normally take. Always when I wasn't looking for him. Once reflected in the dark glass at the cabin windows. Once standing at the far end of the unloading deck. Once seated 3 rows behind me with his face hidden by a hood. Each time I turned to look directly at him, he was gone. Not walking away, not blending into a crowd. Just gone. The detective told me to leave the state. He didn't say it officially. He said it as someone who had seen too many pieces fit together in ways he was not allowed to explain. So I did. I transferred my job to San Diego. Different ocean, different ports, different life. I packed everything into 2 suitcases and drove south without telling anyone except my landlord. I changed my number, closed my social media. I disappeared as best as a person can without actually dying. For almost a year, nothing happened. Then one afternoon, while unloading inventory at the new port, one of the longshoremen dropped a tablet dock manifest near my feet. I picked it up to hand it back. The listed cargo origin was Tacoma. The listed shipping contact name was Mason. That night, a package arrived at my apartment. No return address. Inside was my old ferry badge holder, the same one I had been wearing the night Alana vanished. Along with it was a printed photo of me standing at my new port job, taken from a distance, taken recently. And a final note: you were never a witness. You were an audition. That was the moment I understood the truth. Alana was not the target. I was. She was practice. I didn't go to the police this time. I didn't pack again. I didn't run, because running only teaches predators that you're afraid. I waited. 48 hours later, he came. He didn't knock. He used a copied key. I heard the lock turn while I was sitting in the dark of my living room, with a loaded handgun resting on my knee. I had already cut the power. The apartment was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. The door opened slowly. A silhouette filled the doorway. When he stepped inside and the moonlight from the balcony hit his face, I finally saw Mason clearly for the first time, and I recognized him. He had been one of the ferry deckhands that night. He had helped tie off the boat. He had smiled at Alana. He raised a weapon. I fired first. The police ruled his death a justified homicide. They found a second apartment registered under a false identity less than 2 miles from mine. Inside it were restraints, sedatives, cameras, hard drives, video of multiple victims, including Alana, including 2 others whose bodies have still never been recovered. The ferry disappearances stopped after that. The task force quietly dissolved. The official explanation became isolated offender. But that is not the whole truth, because on Mason's last hard drive, hidden inside layers of encrypted folders, there was a list, 6 names. Mine was crossed out. 5 remain. I don't take ferries anymore. And I never stand near water at night. Because someone out there still knows the routes, and someone out there is still watching the railings. The evacuation order came through my radio at 2:13 a.m. By 2:17, the sky over the ridge was already glowing orange. I had been an EMT in eastern Washington for nearly 6 years by then, and wildfire season had taught me one hard lesson. When authorities say evacuate immediately, they usually mean you already waited too long. The wind was brutal that night, the kind that turned sparks into walls of moving fire. Whole valleys could vanish in hours under conditions like that. My partner was sick, so I was running solo with a temporary volunteer from the Regional Response Network. His name was Owen. Early 40s. Calm voice. Clean uniform with reflective stripes that matched official county issue almost perfectly. He said he'd been pulled in from a nearby district that was already cleared. Everything about him looked legitimate. We were assigned to the northern evacuation loop, a stretch of farmland and scattered homes tucked into a forested basin locals called Pine Hollow. Most residents there were elderly. Many were stubborn about leaving. Fires had been near before and never quite reached them. Tonight felt different. Smoke already coated the roads in a thick gray sheet. Ash fell like dirty snow across our windshield as we pushed deeper into the valley. Dispatch transmitted a printed evacuation list to our tablet. Names and addresses of residents who supposedly had not responded to earlier alerts. Owen handled the tablet while I drove. The first house was dark. No movement. I knocked. No response. Owen marked no contact. And we moved on. The second house answered immediately. A frightened couple in their 70s. They said we were the 4th evacuation team to come by. The others, they said, told them help was already on the way and left. That didn't make sense. We had only deployed 2 official teams into the valley. I told them to grab essentials. We loaded them into our transport shuttle and radioed for pickup at the mobile triage zone. They left shaken but unharmed. The 3rd address made my stomach tighten. The lights were on, curtains open. The front door was unlocked. But the house was completely silent. I stepped inside and called out. No answer. The living room looked untouched. Family photos on the walls. A calendar still flipped to last month. Coffee half finished on the counter. The air inside smelled wrong. Not fire smoke, something cleaner, sharp. Owen stood behind me in the doorway, watching. Then I heard it. A faint muffled sound. Not from upstairs, from below our feet. The basement door was lightly latched. I told Owen to stay back and opened it slowly. The smell hit me first. Chemical. Medical. Beneath it, fear. 2 people lay on the concrete floor, both restrained, both alive, their mouths covered with cloth, eyes wide, skin pale, sedated but conscious. I rushed to free them as gently as I could. They were weak, but breathing. The woman kept trying to speak through the fabric. When I finally removed it, she whispered, "They said you were coming." I asked who. She shook uncontrollably. "The evac team." My blood ran cold. I radioed dispatch immediately for law enforcement backup. And that's when Owen quietly closed the basement door behind me. I turned just in time to see the latch click shut. His voice came through the wood, calm as ever. "Protocol breach, Lucas. You weren't supposed to open the lower level." I slammed my shoulder against the door. It didn't budge, reinforced from the outside. The tablet containing the evacuation list disappeared from my belt. That's when I understood. The list wasn't for saving people. It was for finding them. Smoke began filtering through the basement vents. Thin at first, then heavier. I helped the 2 victims to their feet. Neither could stand without collapsing. The fire outside was getting closer. I could hear tree trunks cracking from the heat. Through the door above us, Owen's voice returned, still calm. "There are 3 more houses tonight. If you interfere again, none of you will survive the burnover." Then his footsteps walked away, and the engine of the shuttle started, leaving us locked underground as the wildfire closed in. The basement filled with smoke faster than I expected, thin gray streams leaking through the vent seams and spreading along the ceiling like crawling fog, and I knew immediately that Owen had timed this perfectly. He was using the approaching wildfire not just as cover, but as a weapon, turning the entire valley into a slow-moving execution chamber. I dragged both victims away from the door as the heat intensified above us, the woman barely conscious, the man trembling violently from the sedation still in his system. Every breath burned going in. The fire was close now, too close. At the back of the basement, partially hidden behind decades of stacked storage bins, I spotted a rusted service hatch embedded low into the concrete wall. It looked like a forgotten emergency drainage exit from when the house was first built. With my hands shaking, I tore at the bins and slammed the fire extinguisher against the corroded latch again and again until the metal finally snapped loose. The hatch creaked open to reveal a narrow mud-lined crawl tunnel sloping away from the house and into the tree line behind the property. We had no choice. I guided the woman in first, then the man, pushing from behind as the ceiling above us began to pop and crack from the heat. Smoke poured through the basement door as the structure upstairs started to fail. By the time I crawled into the tunnel myself, embers were already falling through the floorboards. The tunnel felt endless, but finally the faint orange glow of the wildfire gave way to open air. We emerged coughing into the forest. As the house behind us ignited, flames climbed the walls in seconds. The roar was deafening. I collapsed beside the victims and activated my emergency beacon. Through the last flicker of radio signal I could find, broadcasting our coordinates along with a full description of Owen, the shuttle vehicle, and the fake evacuation lists. Then I dragged both survivors farther downslope, away from falling debris and advancing fire. Real sirens reached us minutes later, Sheriff units, state patrol, and wildfire crews surged into Pine Hollow from every remaining safe access point. Less than 2 miles from our location, Owen attempted to exit the valley disguised within a convoy of real emergency vehicles. He was pulled from the driver's seat of the shuttle at gunpoint. Inside the vehicle, officers found restraints, sedatives, forged responder IDs, and a hidden digital database of evacuation records tied to at least 14 staged abductions across 3 wildfire seasons. The 2 survivors were airlifted out that night and made full recoveries. Over the next 48 hours, authorities conducted coordinated searches across nearby valleys using Owen's own tracking system. 7 more victims were found alive in hidden basement holding sites similar to the one we escaped. Every one of them had trusted a uniform. Every one of them had nearly vanished under the cover of disaster. The investigation exposed a 4-year operation built entirely on disaster exploitation. Using emergency impersonation, stolen responder credentials, and fabricated dispatch records, Owen and his partners selected isolated residents during wildfires, flood evacuations, and severe storms, removing them while the chaos provided perfect cover. He had studied emergency protocol to weaponize public trust. Months later, after the trial concluded with multiple life sentences handed down to everyone involved, Pine Hollow slowly returned to life. New homes replaced the burned ones. Trees regrew. Sirens faded into memory. I returned once as part of a statewide training seminar on emergency impersonation detection. Standing in that rebuilt valley, I felt something I hadn't felt since the night of the fire. Peace. No porch lights stayed on too long. No names were missing from evacuation rolls. People lived because the deception had finally been exposed, because someone had looked beyond the uniform and questioned the list. And for the first time since becoming an EMT, I believed completely that saving lives didn't always mean outrunning the fire. Sometimes it meant burning the lie down with it. The first thing I ever noticed about Mr. Calder's house was that the lights were always on. Every room. Every night. It didn't matter if it was raining, snowing, or the middle of a summer heat wave. When the rest of our cul-de-sac went dark, his place stayed lit like a stage set that never closed. At first, it felt harmless. Just an old man with insomnia. That's what I told myself. That's what I kept telling myself, even when my 13-year-old son started sleeping with his bedroom curtains locked shut. We moved into Hawthorne Court after my divorce, a quiet middle-class neighborhood where lawns were trimmed weekly and no one raised their voice past sunset. I worked long hours at a medical billing office, and my son Caleb spent most afternoons home alone until I returned. Mr. Calder lived directly across the street from us, late 60s, maybe 70. Widowed, according to gossip. Always polite, always watching. He waved every morning from his front window like it was part of a routine he never missed. At first, the watching didn't feel threatening. It felt lonely. Sad, even. A man who had nothing left to do but look outward. But the feeling changed one afternoon when Caleb asked me why the neighbor took pictures of his window. I laughed instinctively, the way parents do when something sounds ridiculous and you don't want to alarm your child. I told him he must have misunderstood. But the look on his face didn't match a misunderstanding. He was scared in a quiet way, not panicked, not dramatic, just uneasy. He told me it happened at night, when his room light was on. He'd seen a small red dot on the glass once. Another time, he'd seen a flash. That was the first night I stayed up watching Mr. Calder's house myself. Around 11:30, his living room light dimmed. A moment later, a second-floor window brightened. Then another. Then the faint mechanical hum of something powering on drifted through the open window of our own house. It stopped as soon as I stood up. When I looked outside, the second-floor light across the street went dark. The timing was too precise to feel normal. Over the next week, Caleb stopped sleeping in his room altogether. He dragged his blanket into the living room and slept beneath the glow of the television because, in his words, the neighbor couldn't see him there. I tried confronting Mr. Calder once in daylight. I walked across the street and rang his bell. He answered quickly, almost eagerly. His smile was wide but strained, teeth too visible, eyes slightly unfocused. When I mentioned my son's concern, he laughed in the slow, practiced way of someone used to dismissing accusations. He said he barely even used his upstairs anymore. Cataracts, he claimed, made it hard to see long distances. He told me kids imagine things. Then he asked Caleb's full name without me ever having told him. That night, my son received his first message from an unknown number. It contained a photo of his bedroom. The angle was impossible to mistake. Taken from across the street. Taken from above ground level. The message beneath the image read, "Tell your mom the curtains make it hard to see you." We called the police immediately. They came, they looked, they knocked. Mr. Calder didn't answer. They said they'd file a report and advise him about harassment if evidence was found. They told us to install blinds, maybe motion lights. They were calm in the way officers are when they don't think danger is immediate. When they left, Mr. Calder's lights all turned on at once. The messages continued. Photos of Caleb walking to school. Photos of our front porch. Photos taken from angles that proved someone had access to nearby roofs or trees. One night, a message simply said, "He grows when you're not watching." Caleb stopped speaking much after that. He stopped eating full meals. He started flinching at headlights. I took time off work. I installed cameras. Nothing showed movement near our house other than passing cars and squirrels, but the photos kept coming. Always clear. Always impossible. The first physical breach happened 2 weeks later. Caleb fell asleep in the living room, with me sitting 5 feet away. I dozed off for what couldn't have been more than 20 minutes. When I woke, the back door was standing open, and my son was gone. There were muddy footprints in the kitchen. Small, bare, leading toward the side yard that faced Mr. Calder's house. I screamed his name so hard my throat tore. I ran barefoot across the grass into the street. Mr. Calder's front door was already open. The inside of his house was fully lit for once, every bulb blazing. I ran inside without thinking. The living room was immaculate. Clean carpet, plastic-covered furniture, the smell of disinfectant in the air. I passed the kitchen, then the hallway, calling Caleb's name until my voice broke. At the end of the hall was a locked door that hadn't been locked before. I slammed into it again and again until the wood splintered. Behind it was a staircase leading downward, and the sound of quiet breathing. The staircase was narrow and steep, the air growing colder with every step as I descended into the darkness with my phone flashlight shaking in my hand. The sound of breathing below was steady, slow, controlled, not panicked, not sleeping. Someone was awake down there. When my feet reached the concrete, I saw him first, standing at the far end of the basement, framed by harsh white work lights. Mr. Calder looked smaller down here, stripped of the illusion his upstairs windows gave him. Older, thinner. His hands were trembling slightly as he held a small device in front of his chest. A camera. The red recording light was on. Behind him, against the far wall, was a second room, made entirely of reinforced glass and metal framing, like a containment cell someone had built inside a basement. Inside it sat my son, barefoot, wrapped in a blanket, eyes wide with terror, but alive. The moment he saw me, he stood up and screamed my name with everything left in his lungs. I lunged forward, but Mr. Calder turned the camera toward me instead, his voice suddenly sharp and controlled, telling me not to take another step or I'd never see my son walk out of that room. I remember my legs shaking so badly I thought I'd collapse where I stood. He told me everything in a calm, methodical tone, as if he were giving a tour. Years of planning, years of watching, years of waiting for the right child. He'd installed illegal long-range surveillance cameras in trees, rooftops, and even disguised along utility lines throughout the cul-de-sac. He tracked routines, family schedules, vulnerabilities. Children of single parents were his preferred category. children who were alone for long hours, children whose parents worked late. He spoke about it clinically, without emotion, like a scientist describing an experiment. He said Caleb was not the first. That sentence nearly broke me. He walked toward the glass room and placed his hand against the panel, speaking gently to my son as if calming an animal. Then he turned back toward me and explained that every child he took was recorded, cataloged, studied. He never touched them. He never harmed them. He simply watched, documented fear, tracked psychological degradation. To him, it was research. To the law, it was kidnapping, stalking, unlawful imprisonment, and the destruction of families. The difference meant nothing to him. I asked him where the others were. For the first time, his expression shifted. Not fear, not guilt. Irritation. He said that some were returned when he lost interest, and others had been relocated because their parents moved before his work was finished. I knew then that some of the families who vanished without explanation on the news over the past few years were never mysteries at all. They were his unfinished experiments. When I tried to inch closer to the glass room again, he lifted the camera higher and warned me that everything was live streaming to an encrypted network, set to auto-delete if police were alerted. He claimed he had followers, observers, people who paid to watch. I didn't know if that part was true or another manipulation meant to paralyze me with fear, but I could not risk calling his bluff. So I did the only thing a terrified parent can do when there are no good options left. I talked. I spoke to him softly. I asked him about his wife, about when he stopped sleeping, about how long he'd been alone. At first, he dismissed the questions. Then slowly, his posture shifted. His shoulders lowered. He told me his wife had died at home in a sudden medical emergency while he slept upstairs. He said he never woke up in time to save her. He said ever since that night, sleep felt like murder. Watching became the only thing that kept him awake. At some point, watching turned into control. Control turned into research. Research turned into obsession. By the time he realized he had crossed every moral line that existed, he no longer cared. While he spoke, his attention drifted toward my face instead of the glass room. And that's when Caleb moved. He used the exact survival instincts I had drilled into him since he was 5 years old. He waited for distraction. He waited for eye contact to break. Then he struck the emergency release latch I hadn't seen earlier, hidden at the base of the glass frame. The panel didn't shatter, but it slid just enough for him to squeeze his arms through and fall forward onto the concrete. Mr. Calder reacted instantly, rushing toward him. I reacted faster. I drove my shoulder into his side with everything in my body. We both hit the floor hard, the camera skidding across the concrete and shattering against the wall. He fought with surprising strength for a man his age, clawing toward his pocket, toward what I later realized was a concealed stun device. I kicked it away and screamed for Caleb to run upstairs and out of the house as fast as he could. He stumbled up the stairs, screaming for help as loudly as a 13-year-old terrified for his life possibly could. Mr. Calder turned frantic then. All calm collapsed, shrieking that I had ruined years of work. He tried to follow, but I grabbed his legs and held on with everything I had. He fell again. Then the front door of the house burst open. Our neighbors. They had heard Caleb's screams echo through the street. Within minutes, police arrived. Then more. Then federal agents. Mr. Calder was arrested in his own basement, surrounded by incontrovertible evidence. Hidden servers, thousands of photos and video files, detailed behavioral logs on children across 3 counties, surveillance networks spanning entire neighborhoods, backup power grids, emergency override doors. The house had been a monitoring station disguised as a quiet retiree's home for nearly 7 years. Over the following weeks, authorities identified and located 8 missing children connected to his files. 6 were alive. 2 were not, having died from unrelated causes after being returned without their parents ever knowing what had been done to them. Every family that was reunited experienced both joy and devastation so intense that it defied description. Lives mended, but never the same. Caleb spent 3 months in trauma counseling. I stayed beside him every session. For a long time, he wouldn't sleep alone. Then one night he asked me to turn his bedroom light off. I cried quietly in the hallway when he did. Mr. Calder never left prison. The judge denied parole eligibility without hesitation. The official sentencing filled the courtroom with families who had been missing pieces of their lives for years. No one in that room doubted that if Caleb hadn't escaped when he did, he would have become another silent file labeled relocated inside that basement. We moved out of Hawthorne Court 2 weeks later. But the street did not go dark. The neighbors replaced every tree Mr. Calder had used. Every rooftop now had motion lighting. Every family installed shared camera feeds. The cul-de-sac that once felt harmless became the safest neighborhood in the county. Years later, when Caleb graduated high school, he looked at me and said something that made the last of the fear finally loosen its grip on my chest. He told me he wanted to become a cybersecurity investigator. He said he wanted to find people who hide behind screens and darkness and make sure they never get another child again. And for the first time since that night, when I looked out at a row of homes with their lights glowing softly into the evening, I no longer felt watched. I felt protected. The first red flag wasn't the missing campers. It was the permits that never should have existed. I worked for the Regional Parks Administration Office as a back-end permit auditor, one of the people who quietly reviewed trail access, camping approvals, and seasonal site usage across hundreds of square miles of forest land in Washington. Most of my job was boring, double-checking dates, verifying ranger signatures, flagging expired access requests, the kind of work that blends into spreadsheets until your eyes go numb. But one Thursday morning, while reconciling archived permits from the previous summer, I came across 3 applications that shouldn't have been there at all. All 3 listed the same destination, Site K18, Upper Alder Basin. I stared at the name for a long time because I knew it didn't exist. Upper Alder Basin had been fully decommissioned as a public camping zone 6 years earlier, after multiple landslides made the trails unsafe. The site had been removed from public maps, trail databases, and even internal ranger navigation systems. There was no way for any civilian to legally obtain a permit for it anymore. And yet 3 families had been issued permission to camp there across a 4-week period the previous August. All 3 families were currently listed as missing. At first, I assumed it was a database error. Maybe an old site code was accidentally reactivated. Maybe a junior clerk misfiled something. That kind of mistake happens. But when I pulled the approval chain, the permits all traced back to a digital authorization signature that didn't belong to any active ranger, administrator, or supervisor in the department. The identifier belonged to a user profile that had been deleted nearly 4 years earlier. Someone was using a ghost credential to authorize access into a place that officially did not exist. I reported the anomaly to my supervisor. He told me to forward everything to internal review and let it go. When I pressed him about the missing families connected to the permits, his tone shifted. He said missing persons were a law enforcement matter, not ours. He told me to stop digging. That night, I couldn't. I pulled the satellite overlays for Upper Alder Basin at home. The forest canopy was dense, but there were faint clearings that did not appear on any official record. Too geometric to be natural, too organized. I cross-referenced heat signatures from public wildfire monitoring satellites. And that's when I saw it. Seasonal heat blooms in an area that should have been uninhabited. Campfires. Small ones. Repeated. Consistent. Not random hikers breaking rules. Permanent occupation. I contacted a friend of mine who worked private land use surveys and asked him, off the record, if his teams had ever recorded structures in Upper Alder Basin. He went silent on the line. Then he asked me why I was looking at that area. When I told him about the permits, he said something I will never forget. He said, "That basin is red zoned in our internal safety routing. We're not allowed to send people there anymore, not after the last survey crew. I asked what happened to them. He said only one came back. 2 days later, without notifying my office, I drove toward Upper Alder Basin. There were no official trailheads marked for it anymore. No signage, no access map. I had to use retired forestry grids and outdated topographic lines to even locate the general boundary. The forest thickened as I climbed higher. Cell service disappeared. Even my satellite navigation began to drift by several hundred feet at a time, as if the terrain itself resisted being accurately plotted. After 4 miles of hiking, I found the first sign that I was not alone. A plastic toy shovel, half buried in pine needles. Fresh, no mold, no weathering. A child's item abandoned far too recently to belong to an old accident. Farther in, I found fire pits. Multiple. Carefully arranged. Logs cut clean with modern tools. Ash still warm beneath the surface. The smell of cooking oil lingered faintly in the air. Whoever had been here had not been passing through. They had been living here. I followed a narrow man-made footpath deeper into the basin. It twisted unnaturally between trees, not following natural slope or drainage. It felt intentional, like a corridor carved for controlled movement. After another quarter mile, the forest suddenly opened into a wide clearing, and I found the campsite. Dozens of tents, organized rows, cooking stations built from stone, drying racks, medical waste burned in shallow pits at the perimeter. But no people. Everything looked recently vacated, food still hung in mesh bags, water containers half full. A child's shoe rested beside a sleeping bag too small for an adult, and near the center of the clearing stood a tall wooden post with laminated sheets attached to it. Rules, curfew times, work rotations, movement schedules, silence windows. This was not a campground. This was a controlled settlement. Then I heard the breathing. Not loud, not close. Just enough to know someone else was standing at the edge of the trees watching me from the shade. I didn't move. The breathing stayed steady. Then a branch cracked behind me, and another from a different direction. I turned slowly in a full circle. There was no one visible, but the forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no wind, no insects. Only the sound of my own pulse and the faint, deliberate breathing that never got closer and never moved farther away. And at that moment, I understood something that made my skin crawl. The campers had not wandered accidentally into this place. They had been guided here, approved, processed, and then erased. I don't know how long I stood in that clearing listening to the breathing. Time warped in a way it only does when your body knows something your mind is still trying to deny. My instincts were screaming to run, but every cell in me understood that sudden movement was exactly what whoever was watching me might be waiting for. So I did the only thing that felt even remotely safe. I stayed still. Slowly, deliberately, I lifted my phone and pretended to take photos of the campsite, like a detached investigator instead of a terrified intruder who had just realized he wasn't alone. The breathing faded. Not abruptly. Gradually. As though whoever was watching me had chosen to step back into the forest rather than retreat in panic. That frightened me more than if they had rushed me. I backed away from the clearing without turning my back, step by careful step, until tree trunks blocked my view of the tents. Only then did I turn and follow my own footprints back toward the narrow entry path I had taken in. That's when I realized the path was gone, where there had been a distinct corridor of pressed earth and broken underbrush. There was now only untouched forest. The ground looked as though it had never been walked on at all. No trampled needles, no snapped twigs, no trace of a trail in either direction. I turned in a slow circle, confusion giving way to dread as every potential exit looked identical. My GPS spun wildly, unable to lock onto a stable position. The terrain itself seemed to resist orientation. I tried the route I thought I'd come from. After 15 minutes of walking, I ended up back at the edge of the clearing. The tents were still empty. The breathing returned, this time closer. Not behind me. To my left. I ran. Branches tore at my arms and face as I pushed blindly through undergrowth, no longer caring about direction, only distance. The forest floor sloped downward sharply, and I slid more than I ran, tumbling into a shallow ravine choked with ferns and fallen logs. The sound of pursuit never came. No crashing steps, no shouting, no broken brush behind me, just the thud of my own heartbeat and the rasp of my breath in my ears. That silence was worse than being chased. I kept moving until my lungs burned and my legs trembled with exhaustion. Eventually, the ravine opened into a wider basin where light filtered through the canopy at a different angle. I didn't recognize it. Nothing matched my maps. My phone showed no service and no directional accuracy. The only landmark was a structure partially hidden by moss and vines at the base of a steep rock face. A cabin. An old one. The kind built decades ago for forestry crews or survey teams. Weathered wood, collapsed porch. But there were fresh modifications. New locks, modern hinges, a solar panel mounted crookedly on the roof. This wasn't abandoned. It was being maintained. I considered avoiding it entirely. Then I heard a child cough inside. The sound was weak, dry, sick. I approached the cabin louder than I should have, snapping sticks under my boots deliberately so whoever was inside would know I was there. The door swung open before I reached it. A girl stood in the doorway, no older than 8. Dirt smeared across her face in streaks where tears had cut through. She stared at me like she couldn't decide if I was real or just another trick. Before I could speak, she whispered, "You're not wearing the badge." Behind her, the cabin interior was crowded with people, adults and children, thin, pale, some sitting, some lying on makeshift beds, all of them watching me with exhausted, frightened eyes. They told me everything in fragments. They had arrived through legal permits. Rangers had checked them in, assigned campsites, explained rules. Then the real structure revealed itself slowly. Work assignments disguised as volunteer conservation projects. Restricted movement at night due to wildlife. Food rationing framed as safety protocol. Guests rotated between clearings for survey coordination. Anyone who questioned the system was isolated. Anyone who tried to leave never returned. They were taught that rescue was forbidden, that the forest would kill them if they wandered, that the only safe way out was through the same men who had brought them in. The girls' parents were gone, taken weeks earlier for relocation. No one had seen them since. Before I could ask anything else, the cabin lights shut off. Darkness swallowed the room. Not natural darkness, engineered darkness, a coordinated power cut. Outside, branches cracked, multiple, all around us. Someone moved past the windows with a flashlight beam that never lingered in one place long enough to confirm a face. A low voice carried through the trees, not shouting, not whispering, simply stating directions calmly to unseen listeners. The people inside the cabin panicked. I told them to stay quiet. No one listened. Someone screamed. The door shuddered as something heavy struck it from outside, once, twice. The hinges groaned but held. I pushed a table against the door with 2 men's help, while others tried desperately to shepherd children into the back storage room. Somewhere beneath the sound of scrambling feet, I heard that same controlled breathing again. Close, curious, almost patient. Through a crack in one of the boarded windows, I saw the edge of a uniform. Not Ranger green, not law enforcement. Private security gray. He passed by slowly, scanning, then another, and another. They weren't hunting randomly. They were herding. Someone inside panicked and bolted for the rear exit. The gunshot came from outside, clean, singular, final. The cabin fell silent after that. Minutes passed, then more. The footsteps retreated. The breathing faded. The people inside remained frozen long after the sounds disappeared, terrified that any movement would restart the hunt. Eventually, when the forest returned to its unnatural quiet, I opened the back exit just enough to peer outside. The body was gone. So were the men. So was the trail. By the time I found my way out of Upper Alder Basin 3 days later, I was dehydrated, disoriented, and half out of my mind. I emerged onto a stretch of service road that did not appear on any public map and stumbled into the path of a remote forestry patrol crew that claimed they had never heard of Site K-18. Law enforcement conducted a full sweep of the basin within days. They found nothing: no tents, no cabin, no fire pits, no trails, no settlement, no bodies. The official conclusion was that I had suffered acute stress hallucinations caused by dehydration and isolation. The missing families remain listed as unresolved disappearances. The permits tied to Site K-18 still exist in archived government servers. The ghost authorization signature remains active. And sometimes, when wildfire satellites scan remote forest basins at night, they still register small, steady heat sources deep inside the Upper Alder region of Washington. Campfires, where no campsites officially exist. The first time I cleaned the unlisted floor, I thought I had taken the wrong elevator. I had worked the night janitor shift at a downtown Washington hospital for almost 13 years, long enough to learn every shortcut, every locked stairwell, every forgotten service hallway that medical interns never even knew existed. Hospitals at night develop a personality of their own. Machines breathe for people. Fluorescent lights hum like insects. You learn the rhythm so well that even small changes feel wrong. That's why, the moment my badge unlocked an elevator option I had never seen before, my stomach dropped. The button had no number, just a blank square where a floor designation should have been. The scanner beeped when my cart rolled in, and the doors closed before I could second-guess it. The elevator began descending, but it didn't stop the way it normally did between floors. No slight hesitations, no vibration changes. Just one long, smooth drop that lasted far longer than the building's height allowed. I remember gripping the cleaning cart handle tighter than I needed to, trying to convince myself this was just another back-of-house level I'd somehow never been assigned to before. When the doors opened, the air told me immediately that this place was different, cooler, drier, filtered with a precision I'd never felt on any other floor. The lighting was soft and recessed with no flicker. The walls were unnervingly clean, the kind of clean that doesn't come from routine sanitation but from strict environmental control. There were identical numbered doors stretching down both sides of the hallway, but no signage of any kind. No nurse's station, no wayfinding maps, no code blue panels. It looked like a hospital stripped of its identity. My work tablet listed the assignment as Auxiliary Sterile Wing, Night Sanitation Only. The department code beside it didn't match any known unit in the hospital database. I stood there, longer than I should have, listening for footsteps, intercom announcements, anything that would make this place feel alive. All I heard was ventilation, a quiet mechanical breathing behind the walls. I pushed my cart into the first room. An elderly man lay in the bed beneath a perfectly tucked thermal blanket. His chest rose and fell in slow, even rhythm. A heart monitor ticked steadily at his side. An IV line fed into his arm. He looked like any patient I'd seen 1,000 times before, except for the chart clipped at the foot of the bed. In bold printed letters, it read, "Deceased. Transfer complete." I stared at the word "deceased" until it lost meaning, then forced myself to check his chest again. The man was very much alive. I backed out of that room and entered the next one. A woman in her 50s lay unconscious but breathing, oxygen mask fitted neatly over her face. The chart on her bed also read, "Deceased." I moved through the wing in rising panic, opening 10 rooms in total before I couldn't force myself to open another door. Every patient was alive. Every chart said they were dead. Some were elderly, some middle-aged. One was a young man who looked barely 20, all officially recorded as deceased within the past 72 hours. I abandoned my cleaning cart and returned to the elevator with my heart pounding in my throat. The blank button was gone. The normal numbered panel had returned as if it had never changed. I rode back up to the medical surgical floor, shaking so badly I had to sit on a supply crate for several minutes before I could stand again. The next morning, I used a public terminal in the sanitation office to search the hospital's patient database. One by one, I typed the names I remembered from the charts. Every single one of them appeared in the system as legally dead, time of death recorded, physician's signature verified, cause of death entered, each file closed, no active admissions, no ongoing treatment. According to the hospital, the people I had just seen breathing were corpses. I tried reporting it through internal compliance first, assuming maybe this was some kind of error in an off-site recovery unit. The report was acknowledged automatically and marked resolved less than 10 minutes later. No phone call, no follow-up, no questions. I called the hospital ombudsman hotline anonymously that afternoon and described what I saw in vague terms. The woman on the line asked for unit numbers. When I said the wing had no listed number, her voice changed. She told me I must be mistaken. The call disconnected. That night, when I returned to work, the blank elevator button was there again, and this time my work tablet carried a different instruction. Full sanitation sweep required. Biosecure protocols enforced. I did not ride the elevator. Instead, I hid my cart in a supply bay and took up a position in an unused alcove near the service shafts, where I could see the corridor leading to that unlisted lift without being directly visible. I told myself I would just watch for a few minutes, just long enough to prove to myself I wasn't imagining things. 2 people emerged from a restricted hallway I had never seen used before. They wore gray uniforms with no hospital branding. Their ID badges were unmarked white plastic with embedded chips that reflected light differently than standard staff IDs. They unlocked the service elevator with matching credentials and waited without speaking. A minute later, a gurney rolled silently into view. On it lay a woman I recognized from the unlisted floor, the same woman from the second room. Her oxygen mask was gone. Her face was pale. Her chest did not move. The chart attached to the gurney read, "Deceased. Transfer complete," just like before. The orderlies moved her with methodical precision, not with the care reserved for a living patient, but with the efficiency of cargo handling. One of them looked directly toward my alcove as they passed. Our eyes met. There was no shock in his expression, no surprise at being observed, only calculation, as if he were assessing a problem rather than encountering one. After that night, things in my life began to change in small, accumulating ways that I couldn't immediately explain. My work assignments shifted subtly. I was no longer scheduled on the same floors as before. My terminal login began prompting additional authentication steps I had never used. I started seeing unfamiliar, resolved cases in the internal system bearing the same ghost department code as the unlisted wing. Then I found my own name in a patient transfer log, not as a janitor, as a next of kin contact. The patient listed was a man I had never heard of, officially deceased. My phone number was attached to the file, my address, my emergency consent authorization. According to hospital records, I had signed for his post-mortem transport 2 days earlier. I hadn't. That was when I realized the hidden floor wasn't just a place. It was a system that manufactured deaths, and it had just included me inside its records. That same night, as I finished my shift and reached the employee elevators, the blank square appeared on the panel again. Only this time, it pulsed softly, as if waiting for me. And for the first time since I started working in that hospital 13 years earlier, my badge activated the elevator on its own. The elevator did not descend when the blank square activated on its own. It ascended first, stopping briefly on a medical level I recognized before dropping far lower than it ever had before. I felt the pressure in my ears change as the car moved deeper than any public floor. By the time the doors opened again, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep hold of my cart. The unlisted hallway waited on the other side exactly as before, sterile and silent. Only this time, A security camera mounted above the entrance pivoted slightly the moment I rolled forward. Inside the wing, several of the room doors that had once been occupied were now empty. Beds stripped, equipment removed. The air felt colder than before. At the far end of the corridor, the double access doors that I hadn't noticed during my first visit stood cracked open by a few inches. Light spilled through the gap, brighter and harsher than the soft recessed glow of the patient wing. I should have turned back. Instead, I followed the light. Beyond the doors was a transit staging area, not a treatment space, not a recovery unit, a transfer hub. Gurneys lined up in rows, sealed supply crates stacked against one wall. Uniformed personnel in the same gray attire I'd seen before moved in synchronized efficiency, logging entries into tablets I couldn't see clearly from a distance. On several gurneys lay bodies under opaque transport shrouds. On each footboard, the same status label was affixed: deceased, transfer complete. One of the orderlies noticed me, standing there, and approached without urgency. He addressed me by name before I said a word. He told me there had been an internal clerical error tied to my employee profile and that I had been authorized for temporary deviation processing. He said it the way people say weather forecasts: factual, detached, and impossible to argue with in the moment. 2 more staff members appeared behind him, positioning themselves subtly but deliberately between me and the exit. They escorted me to a side room labeled only with a code. Inside, a terminal displayed multiple databases running simultaneously. I recognized hospital records, but also saw external systems linked to regional death registries and interfacility transport authorities. The orderly explained, without emotion, that the hospital participated in a federally shielded medical transitional compliance initiative designed to reallocate end-of-life patients who were legally unclaimed or under specific insurance thresholds. He said the public version involved hospice optimization. The private version involved something else entirely. The patients on the hidden floor were not dead. They were categorized as legally deceased to bypass oversight. Their identities were cleared, insurance closed, families notified. In reality, they were transferred between participating facilities for experimental treatment. Pharmaceutical testing and high-risk procedures never approved for public trial. The system generated money by exploiting the gap between legal death and biological life. I asked what happened to the patients who survived. The orderly hesitated for the first time. He said most were never legally reclaimed. Before I could speak again, the terminal screen refreshed. My name appeared in bold text. Status: deceased. Authorization pending. My employee photo was already attached. They had logged my death 15 minutes earlier due to occupational cardiac failure. My badge access privileges shifted in real time as the system updated. From that moment onward, I did not exist as a living person within any official framework attached to that hospital. They told me I would be transferred at the end of the shift like the others. They told me I would not be returned. That was when the alarms began. Not the loud, public hospital kind. Internal pursuit alerts. The doors at both ends of the staging area sealed. The overhead lights shifted from white to amber. One of the gray uniformed staff shouted a code I didn't recognize. I didn't know what had triggered it until I saw the terminal flicker again. A second database window had opened behind the primary one, revealing an active federal audit query that had not existed seconds earlier. Someone else had found the floor, and they had accessed it from outside the hospital. Confusion rippled through the staff. The orderly who had been speaking to me turned back toward the terminal. In that moment of distraction, I grabbed the closest portable crash cart and rammed it into the door control panel. Sparks burst from the housing. The electronic lock released with a dull mechanical clunk. I ran through the corridor without looking back, my body moving before my fear could slow it down. I didn't stop running until I reached a stairwell. I took the steps 2 at a time until my lungs burned and my vision tunneled. Behind me, The sound of boots and shouted commands echoed through levels not meant for civilian movement. Above me, standard hospital chaos unfolded, codes being called, phones ringing, uninformed staff continuing their routines completely unaware of the war moving beneath their feet. By the time I burst out into the emergency lobby, law enforcement was already inside. State investigators, federal medical auditors, agents who moved with authority even in a place where authority normally begins with surgeons. Within minutes, the hospital shifted into full lockdown. The hidden floor's access points were breached simultaneously from multiple angles, indicating pre-planned intelligence rather than reactionary discovery. Over the next 48 hours, what had been buried for years was torn into the light. 3 hospitals were implicated. 2 private research firms lost their federal contracts overnight. 79 individuals listed as legally deceased were confirmed alive within sealed wings across the network. 14 physicians were arrested. Dozens of administrators were placed under federal indictment. The public narrative framed it as an insurance fraud and ethics compliance failure. The sealed indictments told another story entirely. The hidden floor was real. The system was real. And it had been operating quietly for over a decade. My legal status was restored 3 days later by emergency court order. Until that moment, I had technically been a dead man walking. No bank access, no active employment profile, no insurance, no digital footprint at all. I learned what it felt like to be erased without leaving the room. The patients who survived were reunited with families who had already mourned them. Some reunions were joyful. Others were shattering in ways that words don't cover. Not everyone wanted to return after being told they had been dead. The hospital never reopened the lower levels. Officially, they don't exist. The investigators eventually closed the case with redacted findings and permanent classification orders. The doctors convicted received life sentences under medical crime statutes that predate modern ethics law. The funding streams vanished. The research firms dissolved. And yet, months later, when I returned to work at a different hospital under a different shift, I noticed something that made the fear return in a slow, cold wave. On the service elevator panel, just beneath the maintenance override key slot, was a tiny blank square where no button should have been. It did not light up. It did not respond to touch. But once you have seen a floor that shouldn't exist, you never stop watching for it again. The first emergency alert hit every phone in the city at 2:06 a.m. It wasn't the sound that woke me. It was the silence that followed it. No sirens outside, no helicopters, no chaos. Just that single government tone, the one they use for nuclear tests and terrorist warnings, followed by one sentence of text that made my stomach hollow out before I even finished reading it. Do not consume tap water. Shelter in place. Do not seek hospital care unless unconscious. No explanation, no timeline, no reassurance. Within seconds, my phone began vibrating nonstop. Group chats, family calls, neighbors pounding on walls through thin apartment drywall. The building's fire alarm never went off, but every light in the city outside my window flickered once and steadied, like the system itself had just taken a breath. I worked for the city's emergency response call routing center. Not a dispatcher exactly. I handled overflow triage during mass incidents, routing calls that exceeded the primary 911 grid. I was on night shift when the alert went out. Our internal line lit up with more activity than I'd seen in 10 years. Dozens of incoming emergency channels opened at once. Then all but one locked down automatically. That one channel was not supposed to exist. It had no originating district, no caller ID block tied to a geographic grid, just a live audio feed that activated without a call request. At first, it was only static. Then someone breathed into it. The supervisor hadn't even reached my station yet when the first water poisoning calls started coming in through conventional lines. People reporting dizziness, nausea, Hallucinations, entire families vomiting at once, pets collapsing, elderly residents losing consciousness in their kitchens. The city's public works department went offline at the same time. Hospital networks switched into restricted access mode. Ambulance dispatch went quiet. Then the broadcast voice replaced the static on the unauthorized channel. It was calm, male, synthetic but not automated, controlled in the way trained crisis negotiators speak when they don't want to admit they're improvising. He said the contamination was not an accident. He said it had already spread beyond the treatment plant, and that the chemical could not be neutralized in the pipelines. He said evacuation would accelerate exposure. He said emergency care would no longer be effective after the first wave. He said the city had exactly 3 hours. 3 hours until what? He didn't clarify. The order to shelter in place wasn't for public safety. It was for containment. People began dying before the first hour passed. The official lines flooded with reports we were instructed not to forward into main dispatch. The directive came down verbally and without signature. Do not escalate. Do not create resource demand. Reassure and log only. We were being told to keep the city calm while it was actively being poisoned. I watched operators around me realize this at different speeds. Some followed protocol automatically. Some froze. One woman stood up from her console, vomited into a trash bin, and kept taking calls while shaking so hard she had to brace herself against the desk. The unauthorized channel came alive again without being requested. The same voice spoke. He addressed us by name, not our legal names, our private ones. Childhood nicknames, names that did not exist in any employment file. He told us the water system breach had not been external. It had been seeded months earlier through routine corrosion control chemicals. The dose was engineered to activate only when a specific reagent was added during seasonal treatment rotation. He said tonight was the harvest. Then he said the part that destroyed what little order remained in the room. He said the list of spared households had already been assigned. I understood immediately what that meant. This wasn't terrorism. This was selection. People started to figure it out on their own. Not through news reports, but through group chats, through frantic voice messages, through photos sent from inside apartment bathrooms where one person was dying and the other was still able to type. Some households were untouched. Others were collapsing room by room. Whole floors of buildings went dark, while the floor above remained lit and alive. The spared houses had one thing in common. Every one of them had participated in a new municipal infrastructure compliance program, rolled out quietly 9 months earlier. Free pipe inspections, complimentary smart meters, filter installations for data collection. People opted in because it lowered their utility bill. Those who declined were not put on the list. The water had not been poisoned randomly. It had been targeted. By the time the second hour began, the city was in open collapse. Not riots, not chaos in the streets. Something worse. Stillness, locked doors, phones dying mid-call, entire apartment towers going silent at once. Emergency vehicles stopped responding because their crews were being pulled from the same contaminated system. Then the voice returned to the unauthorized channel for the final time. He said the selection process was complete. He said the surviving infrastructure nodes would become the foundation of the next city. He said those who remained were not lucky. They were compliant. And then every line in the routing center went dead simultaneously. Power fell out next. Backup generators kicked in for 12 seconds. Then they shut down, too. The last thing the room heard before the darkness took us was the sound of water moving through pipes overhead. When the backup generators died, the routing center disappeared into a darkness so complete it felt physical, like the room itself had been buried. The hum of servers cut off mid-cycle. Screens blinked out. Headsets went silent in our ears at the same time. For several seconds, the only sound left was people breathing in the dark and the distant, relentless movement of water through pipes somewhere above us. Then someone screamed, and the room remembered what fear felt like. Emergency lighting finally fluttered back on, dim red strips along the floor and stairwells. My supervisor ordered a manual evacuation to the street, even though none of us knew what waited outside or whether the air itself was now dangerous. We moved down the stairwell in stunned clusters, some people crying without sound, others clutching phones that no longer had signal to deliver the truth they were trying to send. By the time we reached the street, the city no longer looked like a city. Entire blocks were dark except for the occasional apartment, where lights still glowed behind curtains. Those buildings were quiet. Not abandoned quiet. Occupied quiet. The kind of quiet that means people inside are still alive and listening. Farther down the avenue, other buildings were lit harshly by emergency spotlights, where police and medical examiners moved among collapsed bodies on sidewalks and in entryways. No sirens wailed. Sirens had run out of purpose. I went home on foot because public transit had stopped cold. The streets were filled with people walking in the same direction I was, all of us moving toward whatever version of safety we hoped our locked doors might still provide. Some neighbors pounded on spare apartment doors, begging for water they hadn't contaminated. Some were pulled inside and saved. Others were turned away because sharing meant risking everything the announcement had promised. My apartment was on the list of spared units. I didn't know that until the water purifier indicator on my sink glowed green while the city beyond my windows collapsed. By sunrise, the official death count reached into the tens of thousands. By sunset, it was far higher, but no one knew exactly how much. The poison had been calibrated with surgical precision. It activated differently based on supply chain nodes. Blocks, even individual buildings, had been designated as expendable months before anyone ever got the midnight alert. Those who lived, those who died, all chosen quietly. 3 days later, emergency broadcasts resumed under federal authority. The contamination was explained as a coordinated infrastructure sabotage conducted through multiple utility subcontractors spread across the region. The primary orchestrator, according to official statements, had died during the deployment. The case was labeled contained. It wasn't, because the compliance program still existed. Investigations revealed it hadn't been created by the city. It had been launched through shell consulting firms that provided efficiency upgrades under a no-bid emergency infrastructure modernization initiative passed during a budget crisis caused by a previous regional disaster. The same people who sold the poison had sold the filtration systems. The spared households hadn't been protected randomly. They had been prepared to survive. Those filters didn't purify water. They isolated it. The spared houses weren't spared because of mercy. They were spared because they were being harvested as the next stable population group for whatever system replaced the dead one. The man behind the broadcast was never officially named. The sealed federal reports identified him only as a systems architect formerly attached to private emergency response modeling firms. He had designed evacuation algorithms, disaster mortality forecasts, chemical dispersion maps. He had spent years proving to governments that mass casualty was an acceptable variable when budget stability required it. He didn't want revenge. He wanted control. He wanted to prove that people would trade compliance for survival so completely that they wouldn't even realize they had agreed to the experiment. The city was declared uninhabitable within 6 months. The contamination never fully cleared from the deeper pipeline grid. Most survivors were relocated into pre-filtered residential sectors that had already been quietly prepared. The dead were buried in zones that no longer appear on modern navigation systems. Entire neighborhoods vanished without memorial markers. And the worst truth came out last. The unauthorized broadcast channel had never been hijacked. It had been built into the emergency network from the beginning as a dormant override for non-democratic decision events. In other words, The system was always meant to choose. 1 week before the attack, I received a package at my temporary relocation address. No return label. Inside was a tablet sealed in anti-static wrap and a single sheet of paper with one sentence printed on it. You weren't spared at random. You were spared because you listen. The tablet contained layered access credentials I should not have been able to open, but it opened for me instantly. What I found inside was the full selection architecture. Every spared household across the city. Every filtered pipe installation. Every pre-approved survivor node. Even the routing center itself had been partially spared, so the final announcement would always have a human audience. I was never meant to die. I was meant to remember. I turned the tablet over to federal investigators within the hour. They confiscated it without questions and without acknowledgement. 2 days later, I was informed in writing that the device had contained no actionable evidence and had been misinterpreted under emotional stress. That night, the tablet returned to my doorstep. No one ever admitted returning it. Deep inside the archived files was a final timestamp directory that chilled me more than the mass casualty data ever could. It listed infrastructure compliance rollouts for 12 additional cities across the country. Different utility systems, different activation windows, different population densities, all pre-filtered, all already mapped. And at the bottom of the directory was a simple status note. Phase 1, successful. 2 months later, the tablet disappeared from my apartment while I slept. There were no signs of theft, no forced entry, no record of access, just empty space where it had been. The federal investigation quietly concluded soon after. The public was told the threat was neutralized. It wasn't, because that final broadcast had never ended. It had only finished its first transmission. And now, every time I hear the emergency alert tone echo from a stranger's phone late at night, I don't think of sirens or storms or accidents anymore. I think of lists.